And so we go to the Lord in prayer as we get started for today in being revelation ready. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We bless you and praise you, Almighty. We thank you for this day that you have made, and we shall rejoice in it and be exceedingly glad. We thank you for the revelation of your word, for the interest of your word bring us forth light. We thank you for all that you are doing in this day. We thank you for your peace, your Sabbath peace. Alone that you bring to our homes and to our hearts. And we ask that you continue to open our eyes to see the wondrous things that you're doing in this word. We thank you that you said that those who read the book of Revelation and keep it as word are blessed. And so we thank you, Father God. In Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. So the next voice you will hear is Charlie McLaughlin.
Shabbat Shalom. Good morning. Happy Sabbath peace. Everyone had a blessed week. As we are nearing the end of this year, and we're, for the most part, we're through the times that we're dealing with. We got some more informational chapters to deal with. But the important thing is that you remember that the sequence of events in Revelation are a total of 21 main events, each one given by the three sets of seven. Seven seals, followed by seven trumpets, followed by seven bowls. The bowls are the bowls of wrath. And as we've said before, you will not, the church, the disciples of Yeshua, Jesus Christ, will not be here on the earth during the time of the seven bowls of wrath. Will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air after being resurrected. For those who have already passed on, will be resurrected. Those who are alive will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, the last trumpet. And so we will meet the Lord in the air, and we'll be with him forever. But until that time, there is a harvest to be reaped. We are in the day of the Lord already. This is the most important thing that we had to note at the beginning, is that the first seal opens up with the event. The main event was 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers, the two brass mountains, as Zechariah described them in chapter 6 of Zechariah, verses 1 through 3. And that those horses were plural, as Zechariah mentioned. Each color was plural, but in Revelation you see only one of the four colors each being highlighted, because the ones in Revelation are identifying the main events that get worldwide attention. And so 9/11 was just that. And judgment, as God says, must begin at the house of God. And this is the nation where, the United States is the nation where the house of God has been, as we can say on earth, headquartered for its missionary commission going around the world. Other nations have carried the missionary commission, but the greatest missionary work in the last days have been carried up to this time from the United States of America, and has been planted worldwide. One of the things that is important to note is that as the judgment upon America is And Ephraim, when we speak of Ephraim, we speak of Joseph. Joseph, the two sticks in not Revelation, but in Ezekiel chapter 37, talks about the valley of the dry bones. First part. Then in the second part of that chapter, it talks about the two sticks. The valley of the dry bones, it tells us that the dry bones are all the house of Israel, the united house, all 12, or we should say 13, 12 tribes that were counted. And then it is the two sticks that he speaks of, a stick in the hand of Joseph, a stick with Joseph in the hand of Ephraim, his youngest son, who gets the first part, the primary part of the birthright, along with Manasseh. And it speaks of a stick for Judah. And what we have to keep in mind as we go through these times is that Israel and Judah have not yet been reunited as one. And the prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 37, as it relates particularly to the two sticks, is those two sticks were put together to become one. This is what Yeshua, what Jesus was praying about, and speaking about, in John chapter 10, when he spoke of himself being the good shepherd. And he spoke and he said he was presently speaking to Judah. Judah was in the land at the time Yeshua walked the earth. However, the northern tribe, which was initially under Joseph's son from the start, Jeroboam, who descended from Ephraim, the northern tribe called Israel, had not returned from their exile. And they were not present while he was walking the earth. Only a remnant of them were mixed in with Judah, were present on the earth. But as a nation and kingdom, as a kingdom by and large, they had not yet been reunited with Judah. And he said that he had other sheep that he had to also bring. In John chapter 10, he had other sheep that he had to also bring. And he said that there would be one flock and there would be one shepherd. And so the prodigal son story is about those two houses, those two sons from two different mothers, married to Jacob, Israel. And the youngest son was Rachel, and that was Joseph. The older son in the story was Judah. Judah was a son of Leah. And those two had to become one. So they were first indicated when Jacob was leaving, when Israel was leaving Laban after having worked for him like a slave, and he acquired his two wives there. And they were there, the two wives with their handmaids. Each one had a handmaid, Bilhah and Zillah, I think, was the correct pronunciation of the name. But between those four women, the 12 tribes, the 12 sons were produced, plus one, which was a woman, Dinah, the daughter, which was Leah's baby. But you had them first mentioned back there when Jacob was leaving, when he talked about having become two bands. He said this twice. I think it was maybe in chapter 32 of Genesis, but it's in verse, I think, like 7 and 10. But it mentioned it twice. He talked about becoming two bands, and that was the first major reference to the two separate houses that would come. And the actual word band there, machineh, that's the singular, but in the plural form, maybe machinim, not sure the Hebrew pronunciation of the plural, but it spoke of Genesis 32, verse 7 and verse 10. And those strong numbers, 4264, if you use the Strong's dictionary, 4264 is the word in singular. but it is pluralized in these two verses. And those two bands would later become the two houses of Israel. So God knew what he was doing. That's why uh, in chapter, I'm trying to think now, I think it's chapter 12 of First Kings, when they actually separate and Judah is trying to bring the northern kingdom back. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, is chasing after Jeroboam, going to go after Jeroboam and the 10 northern tribes and try to bring them back together. And the Lord gives them a word prophetically not to do it. He said, it is of me. God said, it is of him that he's doing this. And so what Israel is doing is following the Genesis 2 pattern. Genesis 2, when God made the man, he made him one. But then he put him to sleep. And then he performed surgery on Adam. And from Adam, he took out of his side and he built his bride. And so he started with one, separated the one into two, male and female, and then he brought them back together as husband and wife, and they were to become fruitful as a result of that. And so he followed the same pattern with the kingdom of Israel. He separates them into two. He separates the one Israel into two. The northern kingdom becoming Israel, the southern kingdom of the scepter, the king, becomes Judah. And the whole goal is to perform the same thing he did with Adam, to separate them into two. That gives God two witnesses, because if you establish a matter, you have to have at least two witnesses in the earth. And then he has two, and then he reunites them as one. And that's what Yeshua prophesied. This is what many Jews rejected Jesus. They rejected Yeshua as being the Messiah because they said he did not reunite. He did not reunite the two houses of Israel into one. They knew that prophecy was there in Ezekiel 37 about the two sticks, and that they were to be reunited. And that was that's the major question that it Acts, that chapter 1, that the disciples, the apostles, asked Yeshua. They asked him, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said those things were in the Father's hands. They're under the Father's authority. But he told them to be concerned about one thing, that after the Holy Ghost would come upon them, that they would receive power and that they would be witnesses, his witnesses, beginning at Jerusalem, to Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. And so what we're seeing is during this process, in this time, the judgment that is going on in the book of Revelation concerning the two houses is that both houses have picked up baggage. How do we say it? They picked up baggage. The house of Israel, which is primarily centered on the earth in the United States, in North America. Judah, after the World War II, after what happened with Germany, with Hitler, they began to move back home. And so when you read the prodigal son story, you're reading about the son Judah, who is at home. He's older than Joseph in birth order. The southern kingdom has been restored. But the name of the nation has been officially designated the nation or the state of Israel. So the name is based upon the pre-division, prior to the division when they were one. The land is called the land of Israel. But only the southern kingdom has been restored. Most of the northern kingdom is being called the West Bank, along with half of Judea, the southern kingdom of Judea in the last days, because they want to have some group called Palestinians, which do not exist in the sense that name was given to the land of Judah by Hadrian because of their rebellion against the Roman kingdom. In 135 AD, he renamed it Judea. He renamed Judea Palestina, the Philistines. He called them the Philistines. It's the same word when you go back and do the research. It's coming from the same word for their enemy, the Philistines. They just dropped the H in the PH sound, and it becomes Palestine. But God is going to put them back together, but they both have baggage. And the baggage is the traditions, the practices, the way of living in sin that they picked up in the world instead of keeping God's law, keeping God's commandments. And the whole point is God tests our love, according to Yeshua, based upon whether or not we keep his commandments. Not based upon our feelings, but based upon our heart as it relates to his commandments, keeping his commandments. And he said if we love him, we would keep his commandments. Yeshua mentioned this in chapter 14 of the Gospel of John, where he is actually referencing when he spoke to the nation at Mount Sinai along with Moses. And he spoke in the commandments concerning idolatry that he would and there would be a judgment to the fourth on those that did not keep, to the third and fourth of those who did not keep his commandments, but that he would show mercy to thousands that loved him and kept his commandments. So he was referencing in John 14 back to what he had said as the Word before he was incarnate in flesh. He said that that's the measure of our love, is that we keep his commandments. So it's important because he's bringing both tribes and both houses back together by being born again, by the blood of Yeshua, the shepherd. And that shepherd is combining them. We become one once we're born again. So we have Jews that are born again. We have Joseph, who has become a multitude of nations or Gentiles who are also being born again. And they are being recombined. But he has to purify them. And hence Jeremiah, we went through this in a previous study, that there are 7 times in the book of Jeremiah that the Lord speaks of a full end, King James. In the King James Bible, you see the 2 words, full end, the phrase, full end. And those occurrences are in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 27, Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 10, Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 18, and then in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 11, 2 times there. And then in Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 28, 2 times again mentioned there, a full end. But he made it very clear in the 4th mention, which is in, of the 7 mentions, is in Jeremiah 30, verse 11. He says, for I am with thee, says Jehovah. Jehovah in the King James was replaced, his name was replaced with the word Lord in all caps, called the Lord. But he said, I am with thee, says Jehovah, to save thee. That's the main point. Though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. And then the last 2 mentions, which were in chapter 46, verse 28, where he makes it clear that he's going to make a full end of all nations. He repeats, he says, fear not. This time he said, fear not, O Jacob, my servant. So Jacob speaks of all of the 12 tribes, or rather the 12 sons. They became 13 tribes when Joseph became 2 tribes in Ephraim and Manasseh. That made the total tribes to number at 13, but there were actually 12 sons. But he says, fear not. Fear thou not, O Jacob, my servant. Notice the word servant. Very important, because the kingdom is the one who becomes a servant. He said, fear thou not, O Jacob, my servant, saith Jehovah. For I am with thee. For I will make, notice he said, I will make a full end of all the nations whither I have driven thee. So wherever the 12 tribes of Israel have been driven, he said that he will make a full end of all the nations where they have been driven. He says, but I will not make a full end of thee, but correct thee in measure. Yet will I not leave thee wholly unpunished. And so this correction the purpose of this correction is to prepare us to become one under Yeshua, one under the shepherd, one flock. The two will become one again. As in the marriage, joined to the Lord. And when this happens, we are being purified by the washing of water with his word, but also by the fiery trial that is to try us, because he's got to get out the wrinkles. Wrinkles come out with heat, as we said during the study. So what we are seeing from 9/11, the first event of 21 major events, the first seal, is that from the first seal to the sixth seal, he's primarily dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel, who was scattered throughout the world, but in the last days, where one place where they had been gathered together as a multitude of nations, literally states, nation states, is the United States of America. Our borders have been opened for that very reason, to reunite the family here, as it was in Egypt. The reuniting of the family was not in the land of promise, the Holy Land, but it was in Egypt, in Africa, in Egypt of Africa. And so what the Lord told us, he declared the end from the beginning. And from ancient times, things that were not yet done. And so in these last days, we see that there are many that are aware right now on the earth. There is a number of people that are a considerable multitude of people that are aware of what the Lord is doing in Africa today, as he's preparing the nations for the exodus of his people out of all nations where they have been scattered, because he's going to bring judgment upon those nations where they were scattered, as he promised in Genesis chapter 15, where he told Abraham after 400 years that he would judge that nation, a particular nation, one. Now, there are many nations that will be judged in conjunction with this, because this is like Egypt, it's a world power, and when it's affected, it's going to affect all the nations that have been aligned and allied with them and have followed their standard, namely the dollar. And so when this judgment takes place at the sixth seal, where Zechariah said New York and D.C. would be destroyed. Why? In New York, we find that this is where the international or the world government is located, and has been there since 1947, called the United Nations. The United Nations is the beast. It's one of the beasts. It's the first beast of Revelation 13 that will receive a deadly head wound. When it speaks of the deadly head wound, that is a wound to the headquarters. It's going to be destroyed. And Zechariah described it being destroyed, calling it the house of the thief, where New York, our financial center as well, is where it will be destroyed by a nuke, along with Washington, D.C. And so when this happens, there will be major chaos in the world. And during this time, God will move his people forth out of the nations. And a lot of people will leave the United States. Guess where their reunion will be? In the wilderness. But where is one of the biggest wilderness places where there's a lot of provision for people to have in the earth? The continent of Africa. You see, he used Egypt during the time of famine to provide for his people and others during a time of great famine. But they were only in one nation at the time. They had been enslaved. They were subsequent to being enslaved there. But then in the latter days, is going to use a powerful continent because his people are scattered into multiple nations all over the planet. Now, this is not to say that everyone will do this, but there will be a significant number of people as they leave out of the lands where they have been scattered. They will return. They will return many to the places of their nativity, but many will go back by the way they came, as it says. And for those who are participants, were victims in the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, the way by which they came from their original place was through Africa. That is, they came from Israel. They scattered. Many of Joseph's family ended up on the continent of Africa. And many of the other parts of Abraham's family, there is now DNA evidence that actually said that many of the people that settled in northern Africa came was from Arabia. This is in agreement with what Josephus said concerning Abraham's and Keturah, his last wife, grandson, what's his name? Epher, who was from Midian, son of Midian. So this is a grandson, Midian, who Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, was of the family of the descendant of Abraham's son Midian. But his grandson, Midian, Midian lived in Arabia. That's where the real Mount Sinai is located. But that his grandson actually settled into Libya. This Josephus, the only standing record, historical record, is the record that Josephus left after Rome conquered Israel, Judah, more specifically, in battle, and he became a historian. He actually fought against Rome. I think it was a general, but once they were defeated, he took up the role of maintaining their history. So he is the only man that wrote the history outside of the Bible, the history of the people of Israel, and more recently the Jewish history, because Judah was in the land when Rome destroyed them and conquered them after they rebelled. But Josephus had told in detail in his history that Epher, Abraham and Keturah's grandson, through Midian, came to Libya, North Africa, and that Libya was renamed for Epher. If you look at the characters in Epher, they've become A. If you transliterate them into the English alphabet, they would be A, F, R, I. And you can see that without, except for the suffix CA, that's all the characters of Africa. This is very important because most people aren't aware of this. Epher is mentioned in Genesis 25, verse 4. Tori had to pull up for those who will look at this in the recording on the channel. But she pulled up his name where you see in Genesis 25, verse 4. It is mentioned also in First Chronicles chapter 1, verse 33. Epher, E-P-H-E-R. But when you convert that to the Hebrew characters, you see that it is, and she hovers over it, it's an iron, which is like an A-H-F, and then it's a K, which becomes a P in our P-R-P-H in our alphabet, as and the P-H-L-F, and as in phone can be spelled with Phone or phone Phone because it has the same sound of both characters. And so it's F, and then the resh, which will become the R. Ayin is depicted in the original Hebrew as a I. The F or the P sound, PH sound, is depicted as a mouth, and then the last character is the resh, which is depicted as a arm, as a head shot from the side profile, which like our capital R, that we still have the original form of that in our capital R. And so those three characters, when you add a Y to them, that's just when you take the word Yehuda, which is Judah, and add a Y to it, or I, it becomes possessive forms, the way they show, like our apostrophe S, which means something pertains to or belongs to something else. So when it says F3, it means pertaining to F3, pertaining to effort. And so when you look at this word F3, we get the word Afre, except for the CA, is that spelling of his name in the possessive form when you add the Y or the I to it, and it becomes F3. And so, and then only the suffix CA, Kaf, the CA is added and identified as a nation. But this is the history that Africa was named for Abraham's grandson. And not only did Josephus attest to this in his writings, in his history, but he also, in that same writing, identified others that had also testified to the same thing. In other words, he bore witness that he was not the only one writing this, but others had also said this was their history. And so it was Libya, North Africa, that was first renamed Africa. And then the name spread throughout North Africa, became identified with that because each of these nations had their own names. Egypt had its own name. Libya had its own name prior to this happening. And Northern Africa first, and then the name became identifiable with the whole continent. But it was initially applied to first to Libya, then to Northern Africa, because that's all along the Mediterranean. North Africa is exposed to the Mediterranean on the south side of the Mediterranean. And then, by extension, it applied to all of Africa. The name is applied. So it's very important to know this because Keturah, the evidence based upon the 6 sons that she and Abraham had in chapter 25 of Genesis, is that she was of a Hamitic origin. Abraham was Semite. Shem, so we get the word Semite, you drop the H from the Shem, and it becomes Semitic. So when they talk about being anti-Semitic, it's really a misnomer. It's really a misidentification because Jews are not the only Semites or Shemites, so to speak, because Shem produced a lot of other families. As a matter of fact, Abraham's son Ishmael, he's a Semite. The descendants of Judah were Semites. Now people might say, well, Abraham's son Ishmael, you can't call him a Semite. Why? Because his mother was an Egyptian, which was of Ham. Well, if they use that reasoning, think about this. In chapter 38 of Genesis, Judah marries a Canaanite, the son of Ham. She marries the daughter of a Canaanite. Judah's children were born of Canaanite origin as far as their mother. But we consider Judah one of the 12 tribes descended from Abraham, the Semite. And so we have to understand the actual reckoning of that lineage is based upon the fathers. It's patriarchal. So it's the father's descent. And actually, you can only trace back to an original family through the father. It's the only one that gives you the unbroken lineage going all the way back. That's your Y chromosomes in genetics, the DNA. The Y chromosome is the male chromosome, and it's only carried down through the generations from father to father, from father to son, all the way down. So you can trace back to the original Y chromosome, which would be Adam. But the actually can stop at Noah because it was Noah and his wife that had three sons, and their wives, the three sons and their wives had repopulated the earth after the flood. But Noah goes back to Adam. But it's important to understand these things because this is the way the earth was identified in science, and still is for the greater part, is based upon what's called the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. And when you go back there, you find the origin of the families and the nations, not based on color. That came from Satan. That came from Hasatan. But based upon language, in fact, family group language. Family group language. Because God divided up, he overpowered the one language, and he multiplied it into multiple languages. As it said, generally in history, the record is that there were 70 basic language groups, which became 70 basic nation groups after the Tower of Babel. So it's important because when you go back to that list, many of those names there are still being identified throughout the rest of Scripture. And there are maps. A lot of Bibles will have the map in the back that shows the breakdown from Noah's three sons repopulating the earth with their wives. And so it's important to know these lineages when we start dealing with the history of what's happening, because often the Lord in prophecy will use the name based upon what we find here in Genesis chapter 10. And you find that record repeating in places like in Chronicles, like in First Chronicles, is going through the lineage again. He's going repeating it. So it's important because the Lord, you see him repeating this ancestral lines. A lot of people are looking at doing their DNA, doing that research. That's something I have done myself. But going back to now, what the Lord is doing right now is, he's bringing his judgment against the house of Israel and the house of Judah in measure. For what purpose? To save them, to redeem them out of the earth, from amongst the nations, and reclaim them as his own children, his own family, his own bride, just as he did coming out of Egypt, bringing them to Mount Sinai, where there was the marriage covenant called the 10 words, which was literally the 10 words in Hebrew we call the 10 Commandments. And of course, we subtract the first and most important one because it was not a commandment, and we split that one on idolatry into two to make number 1 and 2 dealing with idolatry. But idolatry was just one matter. The word commandment is not there in the Hebrew. It's the word words, and the word words also can be translated matters. So it's the 10 matters, the things that matter most. It's interesting that today we start using that word after the mistreatment and the death of George Floyd, because what matters most is what matters to God. And what God said, he had 10 matters that matter most. And the first one is his name. It's not a command. That's why we deleted it when we only call them 10 commandments, because when you call a commandment, then it's not a commandment. It's his introduction to his people at Mount Sinai, where he said, Anoki Yehovah Elohim, which is Anoki, I am, Yehovah Elohim, your God. He said, I am Jehovah your God. And that was his introduction, and he introduced himself by what he did, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Okay, so we want to keep this in mind, because if we don't recognize the big picture, is that God has allowed Shem, Ham, and Japheth, not in that order, the order actually being Ham, Shem, and then Japheth, to each have their turn running this planet, becoming dominant, the dominant kingdom, all of them Babylon. The first one, Nimrod, was the one that's identified. The second one is Shem, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. But then the third one is Japheth. And Japheth basically started rising to power with Alexander the Great. He was the horn on the goat. Now, the goat is the kingdom of those who are follow the Greek way of life. And Alexander was the first king. What that says in Daniel chapter 8. He's the first king. Because the horn, there's the horn on one horn on the goat, but the goat represents Greek. But Daniel says that God tells Daniel that Alexander, speaking of, he didn't call him by name, but we know this because history, he conquered Medo-Persia. That's the image of Nebuchadnezzar chapter 2, where it goes from the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, to the chest of silver, the Medes and the Persians. Persians rise to become the predominant over Media Persia. That's Elam. Elam is that's the region where we talk about our land. And combined would be Iran and Iraq, both. And then it comes down, then the Greeks take control. During the time of Esther, they were already defeating the Persian Empire, and the Greeks, Alexander the Great rises. And from that point on, even though Rome follows them, Rome does not implement a new way of living. They adopt Greek culture and lifestyle. And so they continue to promote. So we say Greco-Roman, the Roman religion, call it the Greco-Roman. I call it Greco-Roman religion, that became world dominant after the collapse of Rome. And so it's very important to know these histories, because after that, then the Lord spoke in chapter 7 of 4 last empires, kingdoms, that are the lion, the bear, the leopard, and this fourth beast that was unlike any other. This is where we've been studying the past 2 or 3 weeks now. And what we saw here is that the lion represented Britain, the United Kingdom, which conquered most of the world, colonized. Then they got the heart of a man. It was like an eagle. They covered a vast part of the earth. They were said that there was nowhere that the sun set on the British Empire, on the United Kingdom. So, and then they got the heart of a man. They began to release the colonies to become independent. Of course, the U.S. had to fight. We fought for ours. We got ours through the War of Independence. But they really, and then the biggest empire, largest territorial, was like the Soviet Union. There was the man. And we saw where it came down and no longer being a Soviet Union, but Russia primarily being the lead nation still there to this day. But they no longer have the holders of the whole Soviet Union that they had before they gave up the different nations were under them. And then you had the third one that came, which was Germany. Conquered the whole world and came close to doing it. Basically, destroyed the infrastructure of Europe. And even Great Britain got much of it was destroyed. U.S., the rising power, was basically unscathed with the exception of Pearl Harbor, which the Japanese attacked during the war. But our continent was not touched. And so we survived to become the world power. And after that, after Hitler was brought down, out of the League of Nations, when it folded up, it morphed or changed and became a new organization, the United Nations. And their headquarters were placed in New York, and they've been there since 1947. The beast, the world government, Now, there's multiple beasts in the book of Revelation. You know, there's two right there in chapter 13. As we went through last week, we saw that from verses 1 to 10 come directly from Daniel chapter 7, the fourth beast of Daniel chapter 7, where the angel explains to Daniel who this fourth beast is. And you see it's mentioning these horns that it has, and the kings that it has. 10 are going to fall in the latter days. I mean, out of 10, 3 are going to fall, and they'll become 7. But we see this going on in Revelation when we compare the three scriptures, the three chapters that tie into chapter 11. While chapter 11, remember chapter 11 is all of the 3.5 years of the abomination desolation, which is 42 months, verse 2, 1,026 days, verse 3. It's stated in both ways. And in chapter 12, we saw in verse 3, the head, seven heads, the dragon has 7 heads. So it's identifying the great red dragon as having 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. Of course, if you say crown, what's another word for the one we say is the crown? We call them the king. So 7 crowns is also synonymous with 7 kings, because who wears the crown? The king. And so when we see in Revelation 12:3 that it is tied to chapter 11, the 42 months, or 1,260 days, because when the woman flees from this dragon in verse 6, she is fed for 1,203 score days. That's 1,260 days in the wilderness. Remember, we're going into the wilderness before the rapture, before the resurrection and the rapture. We go into the wilderness for 3.5 years, the time of the Great Tribulation in chapter 11. It repeats it again in verse, that's verse 6, the time frame. But it repeats it in verse 14, again, where she's fleeing from the dragon, and it uses the Daniel terminology. Time, and half a time, where she's fleeing from the face of the serpent, which is identified in verse 9 as that great dragon, which is the red dragon of verse 3. He's called the serpent, the devil, and Satan. So you got 4 of his designations there identifying the great red dragon as all 4 of these. That one being we call the devil, Satan, the serpent, the dragon. Okay, so he has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. But when we go to chapter 13, verse 1, then we see that this first beast that is arising up out of the sea also has what? 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. So again, we have the same 3 that ties this to chapter 12, where chapter 12 is tied to chapter 11 by the times. The time mentioned there, which ties Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, times, and half a time, ties it to the same time period called the Great Tribulation. And we see here, again, it's speaking of a beast that's going to end up being controlled by the dragon through, well, it's actually already being influenced by Satan, but it's going to be headed by the 7th head, actually, of the 7th. The 7th head is the United Nations, and it's going to be, out of it will come an 8th, which is of the 7th, which means going to rise to power out of this 7th head, the United Nations. One of its leaders is going to become the Antichrist. Oh, and I can tell you who that is. We'll get into that. Maybe we'll get into that next week. That's not really something that a lot of people really need to know right now. One, it could get them in trouble. too, because there's nothing we can do about it to stop it. There's no that person would he'd be like Judas. He's the only other person identified as the son of perdition. Only two. Second Thessalonians calls this man of sin, this wicked one, this lawless one. He has a hate for the law of God. You find it. No respect for the Torah, the law of God. He's a lawless one. The word iniquity is also used to translate the word lawless. But he is also the one who, the second beast in Revelation 13, that's going to say, worship him. We've gone through this, but notice in verse 5, again, not only connected by the 7 heads, 10 horns, and 10 crowns, but it says 10 crowns in chapter 13, verse 1. But in Daniel chapter 7, it tells us that of those crowns or kings, 3 of them would be plucked up, from 10, which leaves 7. So that means it aligns with chapter 12, the 7 crowns of chapter 12, because of these 10, 7 will be plucked up. And that is actually a reference, if we look at it on the map, that would tie into what's going to happen to Germany, Germany, France, and I can't remember the three. Germany, France, and England. I have it written down. We'll come back to that when we get. We'll still have time to get to that in one of the subsequent chapters when we start dealing with like chapter 17, 18. But in chapter 17 now, you go to chapter 17. But notice why we're here in chapter 13. Notice again, it's tied to the 3.5 years, the 42 months of chapter 11, which is actually given our time sequence in your sevens, your 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. We know that the Great Tribulation is in the 6th trumpet. Second part of the 6th trumpet is the 42 months, or the 1,026 days, as it's called, either by both number units. But in verse 5 of chapter 13, again, it ties this beast to your 3.5 years Great Tribulation. But if you note the way it's worded in verse 4 of chapter 13, this beast, as it tells us in Daniel chapter 7, is that he's going to make war with the saints. He's going to make war with the saints. Now, it doesn't tell you that in this verse, but if you read on down a few verses, you'll see in verse 7, it says that it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Now, that's important to know. He is going to be given authority such that he's able to overcome the saints. Which saints? The ones that are not in the wilderness. Many will be overcome even before the Great Tribulation comes, because that's the nature of the United Nations beast. But notice it mentions that this beast received a deadly head wound. And I don't see it because I think it cut off the verse. I think we have to back up. There we go. Okay, verse 3. So notice that when it reveals that he's given 42 months, is the way it's worded is that it would be after the deadly head wound. That would mean that's after the United Nations headquarters is destroyed in New York. Because Scripture reveals that it's going to be destroyed and that it's going to be revived in another location. So that your Great Tribulation won't even be happening till after the head wound, which means after the 6th seal, in which New York is destroyed, when we see the sky roll back like a scroll, where the nuke hit New York and also D.C. Then that's the judgment on the house of Israel. That is going to cause Israel to start moving in the earth as God begins to reunite Israel and Judah in the earth under the Torah and the blood of Yeshua, the faith of Yeshua and the commandments of God. And so we see that once this head wound takes place, there's going to come a point where he has 42 months. 42 months. So the implication here is that notice the head wound in verse 3 of chapter 13, and then it is healed. So it comes back alive, headed in another location. But then in verse 7, verse 5, it tells you that he's going to have 42 months, which would indicate that happens after the head wound. And that is further confirmed after we start talking about the second beast in this chapter, which starts in verse 11. Verse 10 is the end of the talk about the first beast, actually verse 8, when the Lamb is he's going to, all those that run up on the face of the earth, that they're going to worship this beast. Whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Who will worship this beast? Those who are not saved. Mm-hmm. That's why it's important to preach the gospel to our relatives, to share the gospel. Don't depend on someone else. Don't depend on the preachers doing it. Every disciple has a responsibility to tell the testimony of who Yeshua is to them and what he's done in his crucifixion, his death, and his burial. And if you tell the whole story in 7 words, his life, his birth, his life, his crucifixion, death, his burial, his resurrection, and ascension. In 7 words, if you can share the whole gospel if you know about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But here in verse 10, it talks about the way that they will be, people will be dealt with under the beast. It talks about those who lead into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. And then he talks about the patience and the faith of the saints. Why? Because their endurance is going to be patience, endurance, is through their faith walk in the wilderness. So there will be protection for the saints by and large. That is the disciples of Yeshua. That's called the church in the wilderness. And then in verse 12, verse 11, you see this other beast that comes up out of the earth. The first beast comes up out of the water. It goes back to day 3 in the creation week where the waters were gathered together in one place. And the gathering together of the waters, which is the word mikvah, which would be translated baptistry, where you baptize someone, is speaking of the church going through the fire, the baptism with fire. Acts 2 was the first payment on that, but the full payment is when the outpouring in these last days comes with the 144,000 being sealed. It will be a baptism of fire, and the church will be purified. The wrinkles will come out. The first one is water, dealing with the water of the word that cleanses us, but the wrinkles come out with the fire, and the fiery trial is going to try us. And so we see here that this second beast is going to get the authority of the first beast, verse 20. And he's the second beast that comes up out of the earth. This one, the first one basically unites us under pressure. We get closer together. As we see that day approaching, we don't forsake the keeping of the feast. Most people don't know it. That scripture in Hebrews chapter 10, I think it's verse 25, that talks about not to forsake the fellowshipping of ourselves together or assembling together, as is the matter of some. When you go back to the original word there, it's the synagogue being spoken, which is a feast appointed place for maintaining the feast when one was not in charge of their own country. So the synagogue was the place where the Jews, by and large, continued to keep the appointed time. The first one, the Sabbath, the weekly one, and then the other 7, which are annually in the land. But if they were not in the land, this is the place where they would gather together. They would gather together at the appointed time. And that's what we do. We're doing that. The Torah and I, we are keeping the appointed time. There are 8 of them, as best we can. Some we cannot do in the land. We've been going to the land each year. The Lord told us, starting in 2016, to keep the annual. And he made it possible for us to go into the land of Israel and to go up to Jerusalem, to go up, to make Aliyah. Not to go back for citizenship. We're citizens already. Read Ephesians chapter 2. You read Ephesians chapter 2 there, I think it's around verse 7 to around verse 13 or so. We're no longer alienated from the house. Joseph has been grafted back in, even though he was taken out through Ephraim becoming the multitude of nations here in the U.S. But he raised up this nation, Ephraim, to become a multitude of nations, 50 strong. So when you see the number 50, the Jubilee number, is actually referencing the place, identifying the place, the 50, where Ephraim becomes a multitude of nations. And so in verse 12, 11, and 12, it talks about how we were alienated from Israel. We were cut off. We were divorced, which meant we were just, the 10 tribes were considered to be Gentiles because they got divorced. Not my people anymore. God said, in Hosea chapter 1, 3 times he designated how three things that he said concerning their being cut off. The 3 names of Hosea, Hoshea, actually his name's Hoshea, same as Joshua before Moses renamed him Yeshua, Yehoshua, same name as Jesus. But he was Hoshea, which just basically means Savior or salvation. But he said Jezreel is going to be scattered or sowed all over the place, scattered. 2, he named them, what was it, Lo Ruamah, no mercy. Not going to have it, going to be scattered and not have any mercy. Lo Ruamah means no mercy. Ruamah is mercy. Lo Ruamah means no mercy. And then he says Lo Ami. Lo Ami means no, not my people. No people, not my people. Ami means my people. All his people, Ami is my people, but Lo Ami means not my people. And they were divorced. And he says he divorced the northern kingdom. And as a result, they become like Gentiles, the nations, and they're scattered. But in the last days, he gathers them together and reunites them with the house of Judah. The younger brother is coming home. And that's where we are in these days. He is cleaning us up, us, Ephraim and Judah, to be united, so that Joseph and Judah are reunited, the 2 sticks of Ezekiel 37. So this is where the pressure from the beast comes, the first beast comes in, because that heat is going to cause the saints, as he makes war against the saints, the house of Israel, the house of Judah. He will cause us to come together in keeping, returning to God's commandments. So where was this prophesied? Well, Yeshua mentions this in chapter 24, verse 31 of Matthew, but he comes from chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. I believe we have it all there. And it shall come to pass when all, this is Deuteronomy 30, verse 1, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee. What's that? The blessing and the curse. Which I have set before thee. Notice God is the one that's responsible for the rewards of blessings and the punishment of curses. Which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither Jehovah thy God has driven thee, and shall return. That word return, the word shuv, is the Hebrew word for repent, which literally means to return. And it said, and shall return unto Jehovah thy God, and shall obey his voice. According to, remember, Yeshua said, my sheep know my voice. Yeshua is the voice of the Father. He is the word when the Father speaks. According to, and shall obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day. What day is this? The day that Moses was speaking to the nation of Israel before he died. According to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, but with you returning how? With all thine heart and with all thy soul. That then, when we return, when we repent and return to him, keeping the commandments that he gave them that day, he says, then, verse 3, Jehovah thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon you. Because we're captivity, we think of it as the exile, the diaspora of Israel. and Judah. Because some of Judah still out there, but most of them are the ones that are alive with Joseph from the northern captivity. But he says, only when we do, verse 3, when, if we return to obey him, verse 2, when we meet the condition of verse 2, he says, verse 3 will be met, and he will turn our captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations, whither the Jehovah had thy God has scattered thee. Remember, it was him that scattered us as a result of the curse. The last curse of Deuteronomy 28 was that we're going back to Egypt, a reference to slavery, the house of bondage by ship. The transatlantic slave trade. But you see here that he was saying in verse that he would gather from where he scattered. Verse 4, then he says, if any of thine, meaning any of yours, speaking of our people, be driven out unto the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will Jehovah thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. One of those is just like a symbol of, but the other word, fetch, like there's two words that are being used, gather thee and fetch. And then the other one is like the catching up, where he talks about we will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. And this is what Yeshua is quoting from in Matthew. When you look at these verses 1 through 4, this is Yeshua referencing this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31. From one end of heaven to the other, anywhere under heaven, outmost parts, on earth, everywhere, he's going to gather to all of his chosen ones, his elect, at the resurrection and then the ascension or rapture, where he snatches us up into the air, just like that, fetches us up into the air. But before that, the gathering is into the wilderness first. That's what most people don't aware of, because that's going out in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 32 to 38. But when you read on to verse 44, he tells you we come back into the land, like he says here in verse 5, that he will bring us into the land. But that will be after we're caught up at the seventh trumpet, which sounds in chapter 11, verse 15, after the two witnesses are resurrected. But then the six bowls happen in chapter 16, and then Yeshua comes back with us to the earth into the land of Israel. So we will reign with him for 1,000 years. So we kind of gave a big picture again. Here, but we're going to look at chapter 14, and we'll go into more detail on it. Now, what we say, and I'm going to keep repeating this because this is what people don't realize, is that all the chapters in Revelation are not chronological. You get the chronology from where? The three sets of sevens in order. First, the seven seals, then the seven trumpets, then the seven bowls. And the informational chapters, where they give you information and clues that let you know where they tie in, which one of those sets of sevens they tie in. And we found this, is that all of the Great Tribulation occurs in chapter 11, during your 42 months, which is 1,260 days. And we saw that in chapter 12, it mentions the 1,260 days, times and half the time, which means 3.5 years, which is the same, saying that this is happening in the time of the two witnesses when Jerusalem is being trodden under the foot of Gentiles of the nations. And we see the same thing in chapter 13, where it tells you, after the beast receives the deadly head wound, which means after, this is important because it kind of gives you the time, after New York is destroyed, the United Nations located there, there'll be some trumpets going to sound, but we won't see the Great Tribulation until after the sixth trumpet has sounded, and that is after the major event of 1/3 of mankind being killed by smoke, fire, and brimstone that comes out of the army that arrives from the Euphrates River. Okay, so this is important because all of this gives us the time line. It doesn't tell us the exact date and time of month, but it gives us the duration of the time once we get into the fifth trumpet. And the key thing is, remember, this is all about your three woes. Two of them we are here on earth for. The third one is the great, not the great, the third one is the bowls of wrath. which are chapter 16, all in one chapter, chapter 16. But the two woes before that are the fifth trumpet and the sixth trumpet. And so the timing is only given in the woes. Why? Because woe unto you is the worst things that can happen on the earth. But the worst of things will happen in the 3.5 years for his people, that is. Not the worst of things, if you speak in German, for his people will happen in Jerusalem and Judea. Great tribulation. But there's some bad things happening for there's a lot of people on earth, because remember, he is doing what? He's making a full end of all nations. So you have half of the population of the earth by the time you get to the first event of the sixth trumpet, chapter 9, the verse 13 to the end of chapter 9, where you got 1/3 of mankind. After 1/4 is killed by the time we get to New York, D.C., because it tells you 1/4 under the seals. The work going on. And count the work going on at the sixth work. Then you get a 7, which is like a rest period. Something nice really happens in the 7th of each. But then during the work, you see this is where the judgment is making a full end of all nations is happening, but yet he's bringing the two houses which he made the new covenant with, the new covenant. People call it the New Testament, but the same new covenant. The house of Israel and the house of Judah, he's reunited them into one as he's purifying them, especially during that time in the wilderness. And he tells us in Ezekiel that he will, of them who are his, they're not all going to enter into the land. Some of them are going to turn on the Lord. They're going to be rebels and transgressors. And he said, they will not enter in with him into Jerusalem. Meaning when Yeshua comes back to earth, they will not, after he gets us out after this great tribulation, and we meet him in the air, that those who were purged out during the 3.5 years. Why? Because some of them are going to do the same thing that Korah, Dathan, and Abiram did, the same thing that many of the children did in the first time in the wilderness, where they did not believe. Mm-hmm. So you want to be revelation ready? You better practice believing all the time. Don't get fall into unbelief. Because when we fall into unbelief, it leads us, it is sin. And it also leads to other sins being committed. And so Paul says that we don't want to flunk the text as they did. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Because we're going to enter in. So in chapter 14, so what we're going to do, Revelation 7 is after the destruction of D.C., New York, the nukes. Then you have the outpouring that's going to seal the 144,000 leaders. These are the ones that are going to the nations, like Moses and Aaron and the 70 builders that were appointed then. We brought a total of 72. 2 by 2, 72,000. 144 divided up in 2 by 2, sending people 2 by 2 becomes 100. From 144,000 becomes 72,000, going to basically 72 nation groups, including the house of Israel and the house of Judah, who became two separate nations themselves, in addition to the 70 that speak of all the Gentile or the Gentile nations, the nations outside of Israel and Judah. And so when you see chapter 7, it tells you who the 144,000 are, from 12,000 from each tribe, those who have kept themselves serving the Lord. They're like his apostles. They're sent one. They're going to be sent to the nations. And so you see them being confident in chapter 7 by showing you a multitude of people that are going to be standing in heaven because of the ministry that's going forth in between chapter 7 and chapter 14. So if you understand, chapter 7 to chapter 14 is covering your trumpets. The time of their ministry, the 144,000. That's why they are the parentheses. Chapter 7, the first parentheses, and then chapter 14, the last parentheses. But only the first part of chapter 14 is the last parenthesis, because chapter 14 takes us up to the resurrection, the ascension. But then it also starts talking about what's going to come next, which is in chapter 15 and 16, the bowls of wrath. And so when you read Revelation 14, verse 1, just look, it said, and I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, Mount Zion. And with with him 144,000, having his father's name written in their foreheads. Now you're understanding what the seal is, because in chapter 7, it tells you they're going to be sealed, but here it tells you what the name forehead. The name of the Father, Jehovah, is going to be in their foreheads. They will know his name. Hallowed be thy name. They know his name. And these are 144 leaders. Now people say these are leaders like Moses, Aaron, and the 70, which total 72. Multiply times 1,000, 72,000, 2 by 2, 144,000 if you count them total. And it says this is them. This is the same picture you see in chapter 7. But it tells you, and I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters and as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. And they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth. Because this is at the end of their ministry, after the resurrection. And it goes through the details. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. If you remember when they came at Mount Sinai to the foot of the mount to speak, to hear God speak, God told them not to get with their, told their husbands, he said, do not lay down with your wife. Do not get with your women for 3 days. The third day, you're going to come up in God. So he's actually going back and referencing they were not having any sexual relationship when they came up to Mount Sinai. God told them to abstain during that period, as he spoke to them directly. The Lamb spoke from Mount Sinai, the word of God. The Father, the Son was the one who spoke the 10 words. And we see them again with him, the Lamb. These are they which were not defiled with women. Verse 4, for they are virgins, for these are they which follow the Lamb, whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. The first fruits, chapter 7, the first fruits of the outpouring of the Spirit, the latter rain outpouring. But they do a ministry. Verse 5 goes on, and in their mouth was no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. And then he says, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and the nation, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of water. And there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascended up forever and ever. And they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receiveth the mark of his name. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Yeshua, of Jesus. Now, why is this important? It's because here he's telling you stuff that's going to happen after chapter 16, after chapter 19, when the unrighteous will be thrown into the lake of fire. But where he's telling you this is where it's going to matter the most, between chapter 7 and chapter 14, where all the ministry of God is going on by the 144,000, during which time many will be delivered and come out. be saved, in other words, and will not take the mark. But those, he gives a warning to those between chapter 7 and chapter 14. Those who will take the mark of the beast during the times of the trumpet will not have an opportunity to get saved. Once they take that mark, worshiping the beast, they eternally damn themselves. For that is the blasphemy of God. And they will be blaspheming God. If you will read later on, they will be blaspheming God. So again, he let you know what goes on between chapter 7 and chapter 14. 14 tells you what the end. Back to chapter 11, verse 15, right here, chapter 14, verse 14. We'll read verse 13. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, right, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, said the Spirit, that they may rest from their labor and their works do follow them. Why? Because during this time of tribulation in the world, but great tribulation in Judea and Jerusalem, in the world, the mark of the beast is being applied, and people have a choice. But in Jerusalem, devastation is taking place as well as the mark of the beast, because that's where Satan will unload his wrath up on when he gets kicked out of heaven, having great wrath. That's where he's headed, because he wants Yeshua's seat. Jerusalem is the capital of God Almighty. And Yeshua, his son, is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that is to sit in Jerusalem, reigning the world. And yet Satan knows this, but he knows he only has a short time to do what he can get away with. And it will all, his fury of his wrath of Satan will be poured out on Judea and Jerusalem. The woes that are coming back to hunt the Pharisees, that are still practicing the same resistance to Yeshua today that they were when he walked the earth. So the woes will be at their worst there in this second woe of the sixth trumpet. And so then in verse 14, notice, this is closing out what happens in the trumpet. It's verse chapter 7 and chapter 14 are summaries of what went on in between them during the trumpet. And here he tells you what again was the end of the trumpet. And I looked and behold a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown. And in his hand a sharp sickle. Sickle is used for what? For reaping a harvest. Now this one is like unto the Son of Man, because it is Yeshua. But it says, and another angel came out of the temple, where? In heaven, crying with a loud voice to him, the Son of Man, one like unto the Son of Man, Yeshua. Son of Man was always a phrase, literally in Hebrew is son of Adam. He is the last Adam who is like the son of Adam. He's just like Adam. He didn't have sin from his start, just like Adam. Adam failed. Yeshua did not, the last Adam. And it says, and another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that had sat on the cloud. Why? Because he said, with the voice of the archangel, with the shout of God, and then with the trumpet, 1 Thessalonians 4. Now in verse 15 there to 17 or so, he tells you that then he is going to reap the harvest. He tells him to thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap. For the what? Harvest of the earth is ripe. And he that sat on the cloud, notice, all resurrections of the righteous are associated with the cloud. Yeshua ascended up in the cloud. The two witnesses in chapter 11, the two prophets, they're going to stand up in the cloud. And then finally, at the last trump, Revelation 11:15, which this is dealing with, when the Son of Man comes, he's on the cloud, and he reaps. But then, verse 16 is telling you what went on up at the end of the trumpet. And it gave the warning from verse 1 down to verse. The warning for those who don't follow the Lord during this 7 years. That take the mark. It tells you where they're going. It's not saying they're going in there in this chapter. It's telling you where they're going. Because it's telling you those who are reaped in the harvest of the soul saved are going to be standing before God. The 144,000 with them, because they've got this harvest from the earth during the trumpet. And so what verse 16 does is now going to tell you what's going to happen now in the remainder, which is the next seven, which are the seals, not the seals, excuse me, the seven bowls of wrath. So verse 16 says, and he that sat, well, first of all, we just read that. So verse 17 starts with the next one. And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven. He also having a sharp sickle. So you see there are two harvests. The harvest of the righteous, which is sure does at the last trump. The last trumpet. But then there's a harvest of the unrighteous, the gathering together of them. And so, and when you see verse 18, and another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire. It won't be water, but fire this time. And cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. This is the full end judgment. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and cast it, notice, these aren't saved folks, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horses' bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. And I think that's the end of the chapter. And so chapter 14, first it does, it sums up what's going on in chapter 7 with 144,000 ministry, reaping of the saints. In both chapters, it tells you about their harvest, which is the one like the Son of Man, Yeshua, the Son of Adam, is reaping of the righteous. But there's a second messenger that comes out, the angel is saying. And he has a sharp sickle, but the ones he reaps are the grapes of God's wrath. And now what happens when you get into chapter 15, 16, it's all about the bowls of wrath. So chapter 14 is the bridge from the saved the people that are saved in the seven trumpets. It's reviewing that as it did in chapter 7. But what it does, in addition to what chapter 7 does, it talks about those who are not saved. And it tells you where they're going. And then it describes the two separate reapings. The reaping that has happened up to chapter 11, verse 15. And then in verse 17 of chapter 14, it deals with the second reaping, which is the wrath of God being poured out upon those who are not saved. Mm-hmm. And when we get into the boat, you're going to see it's going to mention the wrath of God, the winepress of his wrath. It's going to mention this in chapter 15 and 16. You can read on, you have to wait till next week to get to this, but it's going to mention that, as you know. So we've gone over, but we wanted to get here because I promised we're going to get to chapter 14 and start tying this in. So we see chapter 7 and chapter 14 are parentheses that enclose the seven trumpets down to chapter 14, verse 16. And then verse 17 to the end of chapter 14 is telling you what's coming next. Just as chapter 7 was telling you about the 144,000, what was coming, the harvest of all the great souls that were going to be harvested and come out of great tribulation as a result of the ministry of preaching of the everlasting gospel. But now we're going to look at some more information about what's going on in the trumpets. So when we get now, we're going to go through the bowls of wrath, and then at the end of that, chapter 17 and chapter 18, we're going to come back to look at some things that were going on in both the trumpets, actually the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, because it's dealing with Babylon. It's dealing with the whore. It's dealing with the unsaved. Okay, so we're going to come back and see. And that's why we said first we tied chapter 17, 12, 13, and 17 all tied to chapter 11. But the beast doesn't start to exist in chapter 11 during the Great Tribulation. The beast already exists. But it's only after that beast has its headroom that we see he really wraps it up going after the saints. And then the Great tribulation taking place. So I hope this was helpful to all of you. We're going through these things, and we'll keep rehearsing a lot of the events because, you know, it takes time to get this into remembrance. But then at the end, we will get a chart of Revelation 21 events, and we'll also include the events after the both the wrath, which is the 1,000-year reign, and the eternity at the end of the chart. But our focus is on what happens before Yeshua comes back to earth, because once he's back on earth, it's too late. It's too late when that seventh angel sounds his trumpet. And if a person has received the mark of the beast during that time, they don't have an opportunity. They'll be waiting for the second harvest. The bowls of wrath being poured out. That ultimately ends up with them being thrown in the lake of fire after the 1,000-year reign. So even things that are happening there concerning the unrighteous, some of it won't even get completed until after 1,000 years of Yeshua reigning on earth, where there will be the final judgment. And they all that have died unrighteous will be judged at the throne and thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where Satan will first be thrown. The Antichrist and the false prophet will already be there. Okay, so hope y'all, anybody have any questions? Tori, open it up, and if you have any questions or comments, we will take those, and if not, we'll get ready for that.
Leave one so that's not okay. I am going to. It's open now, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask. Okay. If there are no questions or comments, we're going to close out for today.